or two, going to a public university that charges you significantly less has made you better off than you otherwise would have been. So it's not like what CO's POI claims, that if you graduate college, you can still access like 90% of jobs. But if it pays you $65K a year, you have spent more money, you have wasted 4 years of your time, which you could have been like out to the real world to gain experience, compared to the $86,000 you have to pay to for schools like, I don't know, like Dartmouth that pays you, like they're charging you $86K every year. Moving on then, let's deal with the response, let's deal with the principal attack we get on their side of the house. On our principle, Anushka claims that because this is really contradictory, it only applies to a very small amount of students, or like not a substantial amount of students, therefore this principle doesn't make sense. No, this principle isn't a numbers claim, because when it happens, we think students should have the right to sue the college or at least to claim some form of compensation. This is an individual contract, as we explain on our side of the house, made between students and colleges. Just because other students are doing fine doesn't mean that you had something innately wrong in you, which meant that you couldn't make the same amount of money. We think that's an individual contract that schools and students should be upholding. So I don't think we have an adequate response to a principle at all coming from OG. Moving on to the OG claim thing. The first OO claim is that the highest paying jobs and the most lucrative jobs often don't provide much social utility. This is your Wall Street Patagonia vest wearers compared to low paying jobs that may be good for society, things like journalism or careers in advocacy. One, true, eventually schools and people also recognize that, because even if you want all your students to go into things like finance or tech, the market eventually becomes oversaturated. The reality is, lots and lots of kids, not only from private universities, but public universities all around the world want to get into it. There are many private universities in the world. Not all of them are top 30, which are feeder schools into these programs. Many people eventually do have to make a living wage and do have to work. What does that mean then? Not everyone will succeed. Schools know and they recognize that. Schools care about people's employability because that figure goes into their college rankings, and that figure they have to publish regularly. And if you're not sending half your kids into decent jobs, it is a really big problem for your school in terms of advertising and recruiting future students. What this means is schools increase aspects of their major curriculums, as per Ryan's explanation, on things being more like applicative to the real world instead of just theory. Or for example, schools, when they decide or when they plan their majors in different departments, are more likely to research into markets and help students break into these markets. For example, look into how you think learning this content can help you like work through a career through like journalism or through like I don't know, like writing or something. So like in a lot of cases, I think there are means in which schools can deploy, and there are things schools can do to make their students more employable. In a lot of private colleges that pursue things like liberal arts curriculums, that's unfortunately not always what the case. Often you learn about math theory, like string theory, I don't know, like random things, and you expect to like piece together how to do technicals or piece together what you want to do in life. I think schools often lack the guidance. They're far more likely to enforce or like to actively promote that guidance on our side of the house. Second response. Even if you don't believe this, our argument actually flips this claim. We show why more people go into these high impact but relatively lower paying careers. Why? There is literally a guarantee now you get money back if you don't hugely succeed. It is not to say that every single person who gets into like a career in advocacy or journalism will always fail. Some people will make it, and some people have the potential to make it. But the fear of not making it is something that's often so large that it deters people from wanting to try it in the first place. On our side of the house, we reduce that fear, we provide the certainty. Fine, maybe you have failed, but I think you deserve some form of compensation for pursuing your interests and your passions on our side of the house. I'll take that POI.
Ryan says that schools are now fiscally prudent and don't offer art study or like gender studies, but you say that they have a strong incentive to have prestige. Which of the two is this?
So I think the honest take is probably like the mid-tier public universities will reasonably cut down on some of these programs. But also, in those cases, I do feel like the students likely will make a less significant career in those lower paying paths. But the elite colleges and colleges at the relatively top end of the sphere are the colleges that have the capacity to actively amplify these programs and to promote these programs, which is actually good because presumably you don't want someone who cannot really afford tuition in the very first place, or a lot of them to believe this is a very, very good career for you. But for the people who genuinely have the interest, have the talent, and have the potential to do so, we think it is perfectly fair for those people to be making huge change in the world today. The second argument we get from opening opposition is that public universities will now suffer because they have access to less public funding, and now that's a problem. Actually, we claim it is the reverse. We think on our side of the house, as per Ryan's explanation, we get a good amount of students into private universities. that actually alleviates the burden of public universities that are currently underfunded. And a lot of the problems are actually due to enrollment of students. The fact that you literally don't have enough dorm space, or your teacher to student ratio is really, really high, or the fact that you only have this many number of clubs, but this many students want to be in them. All of this means we actually enhance the experiences of students who are not fortunate enough to be in private universities. On our side of the house, we better prepare students for the future, and we ensure those who are not privileged enough to enroll into private universities can also have one too.
Excellent. I'd like to thank you for that fine speech. Now I'm inviting Deputy Leader of Opposition whenever you're ready.
Everyone good? Okay, great. The first thing I want to do in this speech is wipe out the government's principle. They say that students are entitled to this reimbursement inasmuch as they're often making an irrational decision to attend college, and that universities are negligent if they don't provide students with these returns. I have a couple of observations about this argument. One, note just how unintuitive this principle is. Anytime you make a financial decision, you do so based on an uncertain prediction of what might happen in the future. For example, I buy food, and I might irrationally buy food because I am hungry, but I am still able to make that decision based on my idea that I am very likely going to have a positive return on it. Even if I don't, that was a decision that I fully opted into. Secondly, this is an informed choice. When you choose to attend a university per Anushka, you at every point understand the risk that might be involved. You are exposed to competing information, for instance, college ratings which might exist, guidance from parents and other mentors about which university might be the best for you. And note that PM agrees with this. Why? Because PM explicitly says at the top of their speech, as a reason why students are most likely going to be entering high-earning careers, that students are very rational about the careers that they enter. If that is true, then presumably that applies against their principle too. But thirdly, this is choice reducing. Why? Because students have less access to humanities programs, for example, that they would otherwise want to pursue. And as much as they concede that that is true, then students are unable to opt into a career choice which they might otherwise deem to be personally valuable. So that principle is not winning for them. What is winning? This guts private small universities in universities which exist in poorer countries. The relevant frame I want to note in this argument is that the overwhelming majority of universities in the developing world are private. This is empirically true, and public universities tend to be structurally underfunded. Why? One, you often have competing priorities within your budget because your government has to worry about other more proximate concerns, for instance, direct social spending, which is harder, especially in poorer countries. And if you want to focus on education, you tend to focus on K-12 education. Secondly, when setting up smaller private universities, investors want an assurance that their investment will be stable by asking for a tuition cost. This engages with the DPM claim that, well, this alleviates the burden on public universities because these are structural to public universities regardless of what happens in this policy. What does this do to the debate? One, it shows that public universities are not a reasonable alternative in many cases. And their only other alternative is, well, you don't go to college in the first place, which clearly defies all of their other arguments around about why going to college is good. But secondly, in cases where countries are relatively wealthy, like the US, as Anushka points out, those are cases in which you can just increase the number of Pell Grants which exist in as much as your government has more capital. So in both cases, we have alternatives for low-income students. Given that frame is true, how does this gut funding for such universities, and why is this tax a money loser for these universities? A couple of things I want to point out. One, in many cases, it is just unrealistic to generate such a large return on the tuition Why is this true? One, many people, even after they graduate college, face large degrees of indecision about the careers they're in, even if they're fully rational agents. They don't know what is going to be fully fulfilling to them, for example, and therefore they often switch careers, especially when they are younger. The second thing to point out is that there is instability that tends to exist in the job market, especially in relatively poorer countries, so it's unclear whether you have the capacity to get a higher paying job in the first place. What are their mechanisms from PM which preemptively engage with this? The first thing they say is, well, the wage premium that you can get in many cases is going to be relatively high. Unclear why this is true, given that I just showed that in many cases it's hard to get those jobs. Secondly, they say students are relatively rational, so they're going to find high-paying jobs. But my mechanisms intrinsically answer this, because even if students have every incentive to find a higher-paying job, my mechanisms show that there is no capacity to get that higher-paying job. But secondly, look at opening government's own mechanism. Opening government says it is good to put financial stress on such universities so they lower tuition fees. For this impact to scale, they have to concede that in many cases, this tax will be levied on universities. So what this means is that if you cut tuition fees and this tax doesn't kick in, your university is less capitalized because you're charging less tuition to begin with. So they are in a double bind. Either these universities get slapped aggressively with this tax, or you lower tuition in which you're also making less money in the first place. So the conclusion of this framing is private universities, especially smaller and poorer ones, have less money. What then happens? 1, you are more likely to cut research programs. Why are research programs in particular likely to be cut? 1, research is often discretionary spending and seen as relatively speculative, so it's one of the first things to get cut. But 2, PM's preemption is, well, there are bloated executives costs which exist, which means that you would just do that. But note that senior administrators often have a lot of power on boards of trustees, which means that it's unlikely that the tuition, that the money that they would be getting is going to be cut. Instead, you cut it from things like research. Secondly, it means that you have fewer funds to do things like talent recruitment programs, which are also often seen as relatively discretionary, an additional way that we engage with opening government's argument about low-income students. But thirdly, it means you have less capital to build facilities in the first place. You admit fewer students because you can't take on the cost of schooling those students in the first place. How do you position this argument in the round? 1, suppose OG wins comprehensively on the clash of quality of education and on why it's better to go into higher paying careers. We still win the debate because we admit far more students on our side of the house in the first place, in as much as universities are not less well capitalized on our side of the house. And clearly they agree that a university education is better than not attending university at all. So we massively expand education, especially in poorer countries in the developing world. But secondly, when you gut funding and reduce the degree of research that you're doing, that reduces the degree of innovation that you would do. So you're less likely to invest in, for example, research related to how you can cure diseases which disproportionately impact minority communities, like asbestos, for example. And this is especially acute because note that 6% of the world attends universities in the first place. These kinds of innovations have the capacity to make enormous impacts on society, and therefore that is the largest impact in the round. Thirdly, what does the quality of education look like? Our claim was very simple. Universities are likely to gut programs which are for lower paying careers. And I think opening government agrees with this. But I just want to deal with some of their engagement that comes out of DPM. 1, DPM says, well, you're more likely to go into a public service job because you know that you will get the reimbursement prospectively. But note that their own argument concedes that you cut the programs altogether. So you have no capacity to do that in the first place. The second thing they say is, well, the market becomes saturated if you go into more careers like finance. Untrue. In many cases, there are just different branches of these fields because often these fields are intrinsically unprofitable. But I also just want to point out that we make these higher paying careers better even if you believe that they're more valuable. When you do things like cut fewer humanities classes, that means you have more like AI ethics classes, for example, which better inform how these individuals behave when they enter these higher paying careers, which means they don't make disastrous decisions for society.
Excellent. And speaking of that fine speech, all the speakers for acting the top half, and now invite the member of government to open up the back half of the debate.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
A little quiet.
Okay, I've been told I need to project. I will project. Shout out McGill Union, love you guys. And for visual POIs, please don't say this verbally, just read it. The margin on opening half in this debate is just entirely small. From opening government, schools clearly already have maximal incentives to ensure the job placement of their graduate because their reputation exists in a free market, i.e. high school students choose whether to go to their university or any other number of universities they could go to, so they want a good reputation. This is also why they're not likely to cut all that cutting-edge research that incentivizes the best and smartest students to go to their school from opening opposition because they care about their reputation in a vacuum. We think that opening half just doesn't have a lot of impact. We also think that opening government has been entirely non-exclusive. As Anushka flags from the very beginning of her speech, you can clearly have a variety of ways through which you can solve the problem of over-tuition that's not really exclusive to this debate.
So what am I actually going to be doing for you on Closing Government today? We're going to prove how we actually benefit the most vulnerable students in two ways. One, how this facilitates the transition to public universities in the United States, and then secondly, how this eradicates predatory schools that exploit the lowest income member societies that are the most vulnerable. Firstly, the transition to public. But first, why do I want to frame that this motion literally only exists in the United States? One, in other developed countries, private unis are very rare because public education is a thing in almost every other country, because in Europe and Canada, voters are not that stupid. But the second thing is in terms of developing countries, which is something opening opposition wants to stake their claim on. The problem is that in developing countries, universities are not accepting the poorest and most neediest students. It is overwhelmingly going to be either A, people who are already wealthy in developing countries who can afford the premium of a private tuition, or B, the very best and brightest of the lower class students in developing countries who are going to be attending private universities in the first place. This indicates to us two things. Firstly, if you are the best and the brightest, or you already come from a rich family, the university probably isn't going to be affected very much. They're probably not going to apply this policy very often. They're probably not going to have to recoup a significant portion of their tuition costs. I think the graduates of private universities in developing countries are already the best and brightest and most prestigious graduates in the country. The chance that they can't pay off their student loans in 10 years is probably just vanishingly low in this debate. That implicates then, lastly, private universities in the US. The top private universities in the United States are not going to really change their incentives in this debate. That is because the graduates of Harvard, Duke, Yale, whatever, have a significant enough wage premium that it's probably a very small percentage of their students that can't pay their student loans back within 10 years, and they have all the financial resources to help them make sure they have good placements within 10 years. Where does that leave the very narrow set of impacts that actually exist in this debate? It is those private universities in the US that are not in the top 30, they're not in the top 50, but the 400s and 300s, the Detroit Mercy law schools, but also just the Middleburys and the Rochesters of the world, who just accept lots of average American high school students and are probably going to be charging them out of the ass for tuition that doesn't really have a wage premium because it's not really that prestigious. No offense. All right, what happens now on this side of the debate? What? We fully concede, that private universities are just not going to accept as many lower income poor students because it's such a big risk. But they're also not going to accept, or be significantly less likely to accept, lower middle class and middle class students. The average middle class person in America probably has a household income of $100K or under. You probably have to take out, on average in America, student loans of hundreds of thousands of dollars to afford a degree where your tuition is $50,000 a year, which might be one of your parents' entire salary. That means that these are the schools where it is most likely that a large percentage of their student body currently is not paying their student debt back within 10 years. These are the people that universities are going to calculate are the most at risk of not paying their student loans back within 10 years. But that's the problem is why is it actually, we think, a good thing that these people are no longer able to go to private universities? Because what does that force the response to become? A, we think that there is massive middle class pressure to fund public universities because now you know that your own kids, even though you are not in the lowest poverty situation, it's still very hard to prove to a university that you can pay $200,000 of debt back within the next 10 years. So we think this is going to create a significantly larger base of the public who would otherwise scrap and struggle to make sure their precious child can pay back that student loan in 15 or 20 years. That's a large pressure where now they don't want to risk not getting into those universities. They demand that the government funds public education. The second is that the government obviously cares about having an educated population. If a large portion of the American public is now locked out of acquiring a private university education and literally cannot get in, they obviously have to significantly fund public education to fill in the gap in their economic market. But thirdly, part of the reason that private universities can charge so much tuition is they extensively lobby the government to enable policies like, for example, not being able to default on student loans or other things that allow them to give out bigger and greater student loans. That goes away. Private universities are like, no, stop it. Don't give that person $200,000 of debt. We do not want to deal with that. That takes away a huge disincentive that is blocking public universities in the status quo. The last thing is that just the prestige is not as important, that there's not as much marketing trying to fool, again, middle-class people into taking these hundreds of thousands of dollars student loans, because frankly, private universities just do not want to deal with that on our side of the house. Why is this so important? You develop a functioning public system. This is exclusive to this debate because to our side of the house, because there's so many incentives on opposition in the United States to not do this. This obviously means that we have a huge economic savings where instead of having all of these people struggle to pay their student loans off within 10 years, maybe opening government proves that they lower tuition a bit. like private universities only lower tuition to the point that they can pay it back within 10 years. It is obviously better to just have a public system where the richest people in the country who proportionally pay the most taxes are funding most of it. The tuition is significantly lower if you look at countries like Europe or in Canada, for example, and that just means that you have a much more efficient economy overall. You're using the richest people to provide them. Your education and your population is not weighed down with student debt. It just becomes much more effective overall. I'll take a few from opening before I move on.
I think there's sufficient political pressure to have funding for public universities because of all the issues of student loan problems that all teams in this round agree on. So why does this specific policy create
The most important thing is the desire of middle-class parents. There's currently a prestige attached to a private university. If you can scrape by, if you can afford it, you can take out that huge student loan, you're going to make sure your child can pay that back. It might take more than 10 years. If you're going to do it and you're going to make that sacrifice, that changes in the calculus where your kid can no longer get into these private universities, where it's like extremely likely that it can't. Therefore, you are much more willing for your tax dollars to go towards public schools. We think the impact of this is massive. The last thing I want to talk about is just eradicating diploma mills. Things like law schools like Detroit Mercy that provide very little value, like medical schools in the Caribbean and things like that a lot of people go to. They target the most desperate, vulnerable people who are immigrants who just want a visa to stay in the country. People who are in the first person in their family to go to university don't really know it's a good or a bad institution. There's a reason that these kinds of shady institutions are most likely to advertise on public transit, where people who are of the lowest income are likely to see their advertisements. This is the most exploited group in the round because opening government says like, oh, well, educated people won't be able to extract the most value from their diploma. But we're talking about people who are probably going to end up taking out significant student loans to pay for a diploma that is worth very little or that is significantly valued because they don't have sufficient access or education to which schools and which diplomas are actually vulnerable. We helped this group in this debate. I'm very proud to propose.
Excellent. Thank you for that fine speech. And now I'm at the member of opposition whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Sorry, I actually don't know the order of my papers, so we're going to see what happens.
Organize that?
No, it's just like, my memory is short term. Anyways. I'm just praying. Thank you, everyone, and I'll get started. And yeah, probably raise your hand, and if I don't see you and don't react, then maybe you should start making a list. Okay. Guys, it's not any noise? Any noise. Yeah. Your voice. Okay. Alright. The reality of this round is that the debate just is narrow. This isn't going to destroy multi-billion-dollar endowed universities and their capacity to fund a liberal arts program. It isn't going to make it legal suddenly, as CG's case would suggest, to sort of discriminate according to income levels. Instead, this is going to affect rich people by and large, compensate them for their decision to go into liberal arts while cutting it out from other schools that can't afford these programs and making it deeply inaccessible to the people occupying these schools. So I want to do a couple things in this speech. First of all, I want to deal with the CG case quite quickly, then I want to get into an extension. Explain why it's the case that you fill these fields, largely like the fields of liberal arts, etc., that are deeply important with elitist individuals who can have access to the highest paying and highest cost institutions, and then explain why it is deeply inaccessible and why aid gets cut to people trying to access these industries from lower income backgrounds, for example. Okay, first of all, dealing with the CG push. The first thing is, it is illegal to discriminate people according to their income levels, so the capacity to just do that in university selection kind of hurts them. But furthermore, I just think that very few people are affected per OG, right? There are a larger number of poor students who end up going into consulting as opposed to academia just by virtue of the financial stability that OG suggests is provided. But the other thing is, I just would counter the idea that the increase in public universities is actually a good thing, in that all that it seems to do is make it easier for rich kids to access the spots and the minimal spots that are available to them at the expense of lower income people that really do need these spots and really do need to access institutions that are lower cost for them. So then, moving into the extension. OG proves that this is quite a small number of people that are affected by this policy. OO says, well, you're going to cease funding altogether, it's going to decrease access to poor people, and that is just going to be a huge cost that is going to destroy universities writ large. This is correctly identified as probably untrue in the round because it's just very difficult to do this. Like, you can't just suddenly stop accepting poor people altogether. It is very, very difficult for your institution to get away with that. It looks really bad to, for example, have an entirely white student body. That just doesn't look good for schools. The area where this motion changes is in the universities at the top, though. These are the ones that can maintain their programs. These are the ones that don't have to cut their institutions altogether. These are the ones that don't have to remove the liberal arts programs and make it inaccessible to people because they can afford the cost of having individuals, and it provides them with prestige, yes, to have these programs as OG identifies. So wealthy kids end up being able to go into them, and they're more likely to be able to access these institutions just empirically, right? It is true that the institutions at the top, the highest cost ones, are the ones that are by and large occupied by more wealthy people who can afford the tuition, but also have family connections, for example, that make it easier for them to access these. So what that means is that the liberal arts programs that are accessible under these institutions are by and large accessible uniquely to the wealthy. Now, I want to point out that that this is the delta, right? If you change the makeup of these programs, you fill gender studies, academia, community service with largely wealthy people. And the problem is here that these are people with deeply elitist perspectives. And so you change academia in a deeply negative way. There is less investment into research about effects onto African Americans of particular policy, or into economic opportunities or economic lenses that apply in the developing world. And I would suggest this is problematic because it horribly worsens the type of academia that is getting produced. It exists in an elitist and unequal frame that makes it inaccessible to people that actually provide value to these programs. And I think that this is incredibly harmful because these elitist perspectives cut out voices and skews academia that ends up teaching generations of children to come that don't get access to these important perspectives that were otherwise being provided by people from low-income backgrounds. Now then, in the status quo, we would suggest that people of diverse backgrounds can actually break into these careers in some cases, and that it is important that we get the diversity. And the reason is, like, yes, a lot of them do care, no thank you, right? Like, they do have opinions, and they do have an attachment to things like art history, to things like anthropology, and they want to have their views expressed on these stages. The problem is, you gut the capacity to provide them with aid and money that gets them into these programs in the first place. This is the second part of the extension, where I suggest that aid to these individuals drastically reduces, and so the capacity to access fields like liberal arts, even within, for basically everyone else, or people within Ivy Leagues, just deeply decreases. So why do you lower access to universities in this form? Before that, OG.
The big problem with the extension is that students from low-income backgrounds may want to pursue these career paths, but under status quo rarely do because they must prioritize stable income. It is exclusively the security of open government that allows people to, even if not enter academia, to enter the fields in which these areas
So I think what you're missing is that, like, in a lot of cases, people get provided aid and financial support by universities already based off the recognition that your case provides, which is that it's important to have people in these fields. Like, it's desirable. It's good that we have a diversity of people and diversity of academic perspectives that are occupying this field. And we get that mechanism from second speaker on your side. So the claim then is that the access that is currently provided to students gets cut altogether, so you make it inaccessible to poor students or to people that want to pursue these careers in the first place. And the first reason is that there is a hugely low cost to offsetting payments and removing them altogether. The reason is, like, you are deeply uncertain as to whether or not you are going to have to pay students in the future. You don't know what their income is going to look like. You don't know if they're going to end up paying this off. But what you do know is that if you give them money now and you provide them with support now, that is a sunk cost that you can never recoup. In comparison, if you spend that money in the future, like, maybe you have to spend it, but also maybe you don't. The only certain outcome is that if you spend money in the present by providing aid, then that is money that you have to spend. That is money that you threw out the door. That is aid that you definitely provided, and it is going to make it much more costly to provide aid going into the future. So that deeply hurts people. But the second thing is, like, there is a huge incentive on the part of administrators to reduce support and aid to people trying to access programs of liberal arts. And the reason is, you can just push it on to other administrators. These things end up realizing themselves after you've graduated, 10 years down the line. Administrations shift a lot. So as a result, the sort of short-term incentives that people have within these careers allow them to push this off and make it so that they don't have to make the decision to provide aid in the first place. So the claim then is that, like, because of the uncertainty of future payments and your inability to predict whether it's the case that you're going to have to make them in the future, what is certain is that if you spend money now, you spend that money, but you may not have to spend it in the future, so you avoid as much as possible spending money today and offset it to the future, hoping that you never never have to pay that price. The second thing is, I just think that it is deeply hard to justify to donors and alumni, especially those that have had to pay their money and have not had the support of universities immediately 10 years after if they did make money during those 10 years. And as a result, like, there's a huge degree of resentment that means that alumni and other institutions and donors are unwilling to support these programs. The problem that you then get in the world of government and outside of government is that you effectively get minimal access to the liberal arts within the elite, and you fill, or excuse me, in any other institution except for the elite. So you fill in with people from these backgrounds, you ruin academia, you make it deeply inaccessible to people with valuable perspectives that we want to hear and that we want to encourage. And for that reason, on that narrow portion of the debate that is the part that needs to be proved for anything to matter, we win.
Excellent. I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now I'm inviting Government Whip when you're ready.
I'm ready. There's a lot of different types of private universities, and some of them are great, and some of them are overpriced. But critically, some of them are very, very, very bad. They're not just bad in the sense that they represent poor investments, but they're medical colleges in Aruba and the Caribbean that advertise on public transit. They're Detroit Mercy Law School, which has a bar rate passage of below 50%. And they're places that people broadly go to out of desperation and coercion. They need a degree, and they know they need the credential. But the fact that these universities have such massive leverage over people who can't do very well in the MCAT, can't do very well in the LSAT, just don't have the grades, mean that they can charge artificially high tuition that goes well above what the acceptable profit rate for a university like this ought to be. This represents a market failure, a context where the American government inadequately funds public universities and sends people into the hands of exploitative private universities that end up taking huge sums of their money while returning very little to them. We think that some of these universities ideally should fold or shut down, and honestly many of them will in our world when they're actually forced to reckon with the financial cost. But secondarily, when these things shut down, there becomes a massive political imperative to do something. And I think the funding comes in a couple of places. Number one, the US has a weird quasi-public system in which big private liberal arts colleges still get a ton of government research funding and grants, which can easily be redirected into a public sector in a context where a lot of students judge it to be worthwhile to them to start going into the public sector. So how do these mechanisms function? Isaac is correct to point out that it is illegal to not admit a student on the basis of their income. But think about how scholarships work in the US. The sticker price for a university is a number that very few people actually pay. Your access to university is dictated by whether you get a scholarship or not. So the outcome that's being suggested here is one that OO actually argues themselves, and they would be knifing to reject, which is that in these cases, it's probably going to make sense for universities that aren't Princeton, that aren't need blind in total capacity, to offer fewer scholarships to students that are less promising than are poor, because in those cases, the ROI that's necessary for the university to not pay the money is significantly higher. So no, this isn't income discrimination on admission. You can't do that, very illegal, but you can optionally choose to not offer scholarships to people when you think that you might be on the hook for a large amount of money. Secondarily, I think people will make different choices. First of all, because I do think that a number of these private colleges will be forced to radically shift their business model. I don't think that Detroit Mercy Law School can continue exploiting students if it actually has to financially compensate them for this. I think they need to either bring in better instructors and not be run by multinational firms that get by on basically offering the lowest possible quality of instruction. The same for DO degrees in the United States, the same for overseas colleges. And these represent a very large number of the contexts where change in the round happens. I don't think that closing off is right to say that there is a large margin on academic elitism. And there are a number of reasons that I think OO themselves already identify to a degree, which is that the wealthiest universities, due to a combination of government research grants and also just the massive size of their endowments that they literally invest by equity and all that kind of other stuff, are able to offer very, very large amounts of funding that continue to increase the diversity of their class sizes. So I don't think the margin is very much on Harvard or Yale, but I do think at the level of Millbury and further down, much, much further down, it does begin to have an effect on the choices that are made. Whereas in a vacuum, if you're Harvard or Yale, you're privileged enough to not be able to have to make these trade-offs at all. You can just say, I want a diverse class, I want a class that is going to do lots of different stuff in terms of different academic fields, and it also probably hurts them to be accused of radically shifting their elitism in a context where these guys are in front of the Supreme Court right now. They face a lot of political pressures surrounding these ideals. So I don't think it's right to say that there'll be a large shift in those contexts. Where I do think that there will be a large shift in terms of students going, though, is private universities that either have to lower their tuition by a degree simply to continue attracting students, or they'll begin to suffer in terms of competition to private universities. That is, if for-profit universities are not successful at cutting down their costs and have to spend lots of money paying out past students, then their ability to attract future students is also lower, because if I'm Middlebury, I have to start paying a lot of money out to students who I didn't do a good job for, then I have less money to spend on research and scholarships to attract new students. That's the mechanism that Isaac misses, which is now Middlebury is at a competitive disadvantage, or any other college, and honestly Middlebury is great, so probably we have to go further down. But realistically, but realistically, they now suffer competition-wise to public universities. There are two effects. Number one, many good students who would previously have been considering a middle-tier private university, a liberal arts college that might not offer a good ROI, begin to go to public universities because the level of attraction that these universities are able to provide in terms of scholarships, in terms of prestige, begins to decrease as students flow away because they just can't offer them as many scholarships to offset the cost. Over time, that shifts the prestige and the quality of the student body at public universities, which over time encourages governments to spend more money on research grants because that's where the best students are, that's the university rankings begin to shift in terms of how students report on terms of academic quality and so on. But even if you don't believe that there's a large shift on the middle, you should believe that there is a massive shift at the very bottom, which is that even if the margin on Harvard, Yale, Middlebury, whatever is small, I do think that there are millions of students who are attending private universities that are exploited corporations that either shouldn't exist in their current form or should be forced to pay recompense. I think the reason this is relevant is that it seems to make the principle actually make sense. Because the issue with the opening government principle is that it doesn't seem that universities right now contractually make an agreement to do exactly this. There's an implicit understanding that it's still up to you to get good grades and find a job and so on. But with private universities, they do make very direct promises that you will pay us, not just cost, as in a sense you'll pay us like just tuition, but you'll pay us a profit for a service which involves getting you into a professional school and helping you to achieve success, which is directly obviated. So I think that the impact is much larger in this case. Opening.
Rita says sham universities are bad because they exploit people like immigrants who want a degree for like visa reasons, let's say. But what happens to these groups of people? Like what happens to the immigrants who wanted their degree for visa reasons?
Yeah, I just think if you look at the statistics on these universities, and this is very widely known, almost all of them function either as visa mills, where the vast majority of people don't successfully keep their visas over time, or are subject to very low scores in the lottery system, and it probably would have been better if they didn't spend $50,000 US on false promises. Many of these universities are involved in huge amounts of litigation. I do think it's probably a good thing to force them to pay millions upon millions of dollars of restitution to people, which immediately happens upon passage of this motion. So seemingly there's a very large outcome. The last claim made by closing opposition is that big universities are going to be incentivized to decrease their support and aid to the most vulnerable. And I think that the problem with this mechanism is just that it applies least in the context where they've said it's most likely that we also have elitism at the very top universities. Where the mechanism does apply is in the context that we've made most relevant, middle and down. Universities where if they began to stop offering scholarships because they weren't financially able to, because they had to pay out so much money, they would begin to struggle to attract students. That creates a very large incentive for universities to avoid having to make these payouts and lower tuition from their massive endowments, which they can afford to. Like they have this money right now. They can take it tomorrow and spend it. Otherwise, they begin to lose top students. They begin to lose top research outputters to public universities. Either there ends up being very large political will once you get rid of many of these private institutions and deplatform and remove their power to make the public system better, or you simply move people in terms of where their dollars go. Either way, you've removed exploitation, which seems to be a very, very important impact on the ground, or you've shifted incentives, made the public system better. Very proud to post.
I then speak the fine speech, and now I'd like the opposition whip to conclude this final.
Sorry, I have the same paper issue, but unlike Isaac, I don't have the confidence to just wing it. So I am taking the time to put them in order. Thanks everyone for judging. It's been a tournament. And thank you so much for me and PvP for being here every round and just being such a joy to hang out with. CEO has chosen to try and win the round by resisting the siren song that happens in every final where you just try to out-impact every other team in the final. I think it's really ironic that Rena starts by being like, everyone agrees the margin of change is really small, right? And goes to, and then we reform the American public school system. That's really ironic. For OG to start by being like, again, this is only a very, very small number of students. And then goes to, and then you strip all of these universities of their ability to send people into socially neutral options. Like, fundamentally, the shift is going to be pretty small and it's well established down the bench. So what we do then is we just ask everyone if for some reason this were actually to be implemented in the real world, which would never be a horrible idea, but if this were to happen, like what would this actually end up looking like? And we identified the pressure points most acutely. What are these pressure points? So I think that we agreed across the board that there is an enormous number of students who ends up being unable to recoup their tuitions for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because most people do end up unfortunately feeding the burn to make sure that they earn money in the short term, which then means that a lot of low-income students who take on debt then end up trying their very hardest to earn money. And they usually succeed because, frankly, 10 years is a long time. I think that 10 years isn't just like the same starting salary times 10, which oftentimes already is enough to pay back college debt because not every school is Dartmouth and charges insane amounts of money. But number two, it's also the case that you end up scaling up pretty quickly because you get promoted to a middle manager in, I don't know, like 3 years, and then you become much more employable across the world. Like people end up job hopping a lot because they just want to find another place that is able to earn them money. I think it's just true that if you go to a decent school that charges you money, you're able to make money on it for the most part. Who then is unable to make their money back? Two groups. The first is the group CG identifies, those who are flat out exploited, and number two, people who can't afford to pay this back, who can't afford to just not make money, i.e. those who have substantial amounts of familial support and funding to fall back on because their parents really, really love them. So what I'm going to do is first explain why I think the CG group on exploitation isn't a large part of the debate before then weighing our impact on academic elitism and the closure of really important spaces to everyone except those who had a private tuition and a parental attention when they were kids to get into IB League schools in the future is really, really toxic, and I think outweighs other teams' impacts on a combination of probability as well as like severity. So first on CG. So I'm going to first address very briefly their public school thing. I'm going to not spend too much time on it because they gave up on it themselves, but I'm going to flip their impact, which is to say, in their best case scenario that they do prove that rich kids or middle-income kids now flood into public schools, I think that that's horrible. The reason is because this edges out other low-income kids who currently depend on the free education that's given to them by public schools. They say middle-class people have the funds and have the political power necessary to push for the expansion of the public school system. Two issues. One, there's an enormous time lag because you have a sudden explosion in demand, apparently, but not that much ability to just suddenly build a school and hire all of these academics up to par. But number two, because I think that the people who end up being displaced are the people who are relatively low income and don't have substantial amounts of political power. So I think their best case involves tons of people who otherwise would have gone to university, instead going to things such as community college, which unfortunately is stigmatized, even though it provides a good education, or, I don't know, just don't go to school at all, thus severely limiting the options available to you later in life. Maybe you'll credit that as an extension, hopefully you do. But the second main thing is that I also just think that their worst case scenario of exploitation is really, really not a big deal. The first thing is because I think mediocre private schools, they're being quite like extreme about how people who go into them in the invariably come out like doomed and penniless. And the reason for this is because like even if it is the case that you end up going into medicine, for example, even if it costs you a lot of money, the 10-year period only clicks in after you graduate from your last degree, and then you have 10 years to become a doctor, for example. And therefore, like, the use case of this debate really is about unemployment, which I think is not going to happen super often in these cases. But number two, I just want to prove really substantial and importantly that competition between universities is currently very stiff. And the reason this matters is because you don't have the surplus of universities